Welcome to Risk Engineers Talk Governance. In this episode, due diligence engineers Richard Robinson and Gaye Francis discuss silos, the due diligence difficulties, and how they deal with siloed competing interests. We hope you enjoy the chat. If you do, please give us a rating and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. If you'd like more information on R2A's work or have any feedback or topic ideas, please head to the website r2a.com.au.
Hi, Richard.
Hello, Gaye. Back again.
We are back again. Today we're going to talk about silos and the difficulty that we've seen with silos over the last little while.
And how we deal with silos.
I think they've been separating out more recently into different categories, and I guess, that it's very difficult to come to a due diligence solution or answer when everybody's doing things in silos.
I think that's correct. I think that's one of the reasons why on our last podcast we were talking about, we need to be relevant, reasoned and concise. But when you're split into silos, everybody tries to make a justify a course of action from their own silo. You suddenly have all these competing interests, and whatever you get when you consolidate it is usually a mess and rather scrappy.
And I guess we can just say that we've seen this in a whole lot of applications. It's not just in safety, it's in projects, it's in SIL ratings, it's in a whole lot of things.
Well, it's part, and it sort of again flows on from some of the other discussions we had about the way in which the history of these things actually was created. I mean, now I'm actually going past and talking about how long I've been in this business, but the Risk Engineering Society of Engineers Australia originally started as the loss control section of the management branch of Victoria Division of Engineers Australia by a whole bunch of ex-factory mutual engineers, of which I was one of them. Factory Mutual's based in Melbourne, that's why there was a collection of them
Here.
in this location, right? Actually, it was actually rather close, the vote, because I do remember the vote as to whether or not it should be part of Engineers Australia, because there's actually an argument to say that it shouldn't be. And as I said, it started as the loss control section, which in a sense was perhaps more allied to the insurance industry than to engineers per se. But then one of my former business partners, Derek Viner, dreamed up the idea of calling the risk engineers following on from factory mutual HPR, highly protected risk engineering, as a concept. And that was something that just flashed around the planet in a most extraordinary speed. Everybody became risk engineers all over the planet. It was something that I was completely astonished about, but anyway, that's what sort of happened. But anyway, time went on, and then rather than risk being a generic thing, which is what we were trying to do, and what from a common law viewpoint and from the point of view of what we then just thought was where the WHS legislation was going, but this overarching thing dealing with the subject of risk. You might recall we tried to convince the Risk Engineering Society to change its name to the Due Diligence Society, which hasn't been a success.
No, we were unsuccessful in that attempt.
Yep. But then the Fire Engineering Society of Engineers Australia appeared, and it sort of hived off that part of what we had considered to be an integrated aspect of risk to somewhere else. It certainly confused perhaps some factory mutual type HPR engineers, because to a very great extent the fires and explosions is what factory mutual was focused on. I mean, the whole point of BLEV is boiling liquid expanding vapour cloud explosions. That was a term dreamed up by factory mutual researchers in the 50s and 60s, I recall, because that's what I got fed in the 70s, the late 70s. So yes, I have been around for a long time. Now, what got us completely stumped, and this subdivision into silos of activity, that's been proceeding apace, because just think of registration of engineers and the fire engineers, their own little group. Yeah. And yet, as we sort of been explaining, if you just look at that in isolation, you get completely confused. And Frank Stocks, our Kiwi associate, he's just been doing expert witness matter for some fellow who went over the edge at one of the harbours and drowned. And he'd been giving advice to various councils on this sort of thing. He is he's an architect actually, but he has a PhD in CEPTED, crime prevention through environmental design. And his point has been, and that's where he's just been given this expert witness stuff and the coroner in New Zealand and the provision of the WSHA in their case apply, that to do and just make a decision on a silo doesn't make sense. You've got to have all the parties there. For example, one of the things that Kiwis really do like is their waterfronts, and it's part of their social environment, and they don't want to have great fences everywhere stopping people falling over the edge. And yet obviously there's a danger there, particularly with kids. And Frank was sort of saying, well, what you've got to do is get all the relevant experts together, the people who want to make sure the access is maintained to the waterfront and so forth. They said, where there's a bar, you can have a glass wall there with a glass top on it, proper plate glass, so it's not going to shatter.
Yeah.
And so people can have a drink and look at the water and admire things. And another place you might do other treatments. And yes, the risk levels might change in one way, but what you need is an integrated solution that satisfies all the competing interests in a way that demonstrates due diligence. And you won't be getting a constant level of risk all over the place because that's just not the nature of the thing, but you will have demonstrated due diligence all over the place, which is what the purpose is.
But you won't get that solution if you keep thinking about it in silos.
No. And using target levels of risk and safety, for example, you will be completely confused.
So the key is to get the due diligence argument, you really need to bring those silos together, and we've seen it a lot in projects as well. Often somebody's got an idea and management do it, but they haven't talked to necessarily the operations or the maintenance staff of how it's going to be done. And so things are promised and done in isolation without considering all of the key parties, and then trying to bring it back together is quite difficult.
Well, and that's actually what we wind up doing. If you sort of say, what does a due diligence engineer do? Well, in a way, you're making sure that the silos get back together again, so the decision that's made and the way it's presented is diligent for the whole organisation and all the players, including anybody who's actually exposed to the risk itself. I mean, one of the reasons why we're not RPEQ or RPV, being a registered engineer in Queensland or Victoria, is because what we do does not require it. We've talked about this a number of occasions, like RPEQ. And it's like that example we gave at one of the recently was about the fire engineers and things like that. We're setting up the argument of the WHS legislation as to why something needs to be done. And then that design is implemented and signed off by the relevant design engineer.
With the support of all of the key stakeholders
Which
and
means
all of the different
the fire
silos.
engineers are grateful for the answer.
Yeah.
But there's no point in us being registered because what are we? There's no such registration for due diligence engineers.
No. Well, we always said that a large part of our job is that facilitation process and communication process, and bringing due process to things so that those arguments can be had in a constructive manner.
Yeah, and the way we do it, I mean, I guess what sort of puzzles me, it's not as though we do anything which is astounding in the sense of the process. You go and talk to all the relevant parties, pick the core ideas, put it together in sort of some simplified form, and then run a workshop and test it with everybody. This is not rocket science.
It's not rocket science, but you have to have a considered way of thinking about things and a structured process to go through.
Actually, I tell a lie there, actually. That the reason why the Space Shuttle blew up was because the O-rings got wrong, and if they'd actually done what we'd said, the problem was they had two O-rings, but they'd never launched when it was cold, and they didn't really know how the O-rings would perform.
Right.
And the only reason why they had to have the O-rings was because they had to spread the manufacturing out across America. And if they'd manufactured it close to where the rockets would, they would have manufactured as a single integrated without the need to join the bits together and have the O-rings. So not only did they fail to eliminate the hazard, they also then said, we've never had an O-ring fail, we've got two, so we've got backup. But the engineers were saying, you've never launched when it's this cold. We don't know what the performance of the O-rings will be in that conditions. So, yes, due diligence would have addressed it, and to a very great extent, the Americans set themselves up for the fall by the silos that they've been creating.
I also think you just set up potentially another podcast about quality assurance and the ability to test, challenge and question.
Yeah, probably.
So just going back to that silo thing, we have seen a lot of organisations break out into silos and try and solve the issue of concern within those silos.
Yeah, but the other problem, but the reason why it drives us crazy is a bit like the safety function, breaking it out and putting the safety specialists over there and not recognising that risk management's a line management function just sets you up for a fall.
Yeah. Well, it should almost be all business as usual stuff, isn't it? Integrated into the whole of business. But what we say is that the due diligence process and demonstrating so far does get you over that silo and people having their own views on things in their own silos and not necessarily, it has to be integrated though.
Yep.
So we hope you found that interesting. Thank you for joining us today, Richard, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Gaye.